We live in very fascinating times. One where the majority of people feel this urgent and overwhelming desire to share everything from baby pictures to pictures of a decadent dessert, share them with total strangers and let them marvel at one's ability to craft opinions. And in the end, our social media culture has turned us into over-texting, oversharing potential nimrods who think everything we say is important, when far too often it's not only unimportant, but it's also insulting and can lead to unemployment. Let's listen up and get a lesson. Welcome back, CNBC contributor, noted author and New York Times bestseller, radio talker, and shy, demure wallflower, whom we love to have here on the show. Carol Roth joins us. Hi, Carol.
Hi, Ed. I have to say, excellent use of the word Nimrod in that opening. It was fantastic.
It's a word that I think sometimes is very underused when it comes down to people in social media, especially when we talk about those who've just got to share everything. Let's put it this way. It's a nice word to use, correct?
I think it's an accurate word, and the challenge is that social media has now become the court of public opinion on steroids, but the problem is that you will never get a fair trial. So even if you are sharing something that you think might be innocuous or perhaps not as bad as somebody else might interpret it to be, it doesn't matter because it is going to be misrepresented, it is going to be dissected, and it's going to be put out all over for everyone to see, and it's not going to go away. And we are continually seeing very high-profile people, most recently Keith Olbermann from ESPN yesterday, who was suspended after getting into a war of words with some Penn State students over Twitter. But we've seen this time and time again. This was Jeb Bush's head of digital strategy, was hired and fired within like a day or two because some of the things he had put out in the past. And even somebody like Amy Pascal at Sony, whose replacement was brought in today because her emails that she thought were private ended up being leaked, and now everybody was dissecting them. So you have to really mean what you say what you mean, and be willing to stand behind anything that you put down in any format, even if you think it's private, but especially if it's public. If you put it out there, then you have to say that, Ed, you and I are going to be discussing this at some point in the future, and you have to be willing to stand behind it, and it could end up costing you your job.
Well, here's the one thing, though, that I think we've got to look at here. Olbermann, whom you mentioned, he tweeted out, he was in a Twitter war with students at Penn State saying PSU students are pitiful because they're PSU students, period. Okay, came back, went again, apologized, back and forth. ESPN is loaded with commentators who are constantly saying things that are insulting, negative, overbearing, to the point of really being rapidly offensive sometimes, and yet they don't get punished. So where do you draw the line here? Because in many ways, you and I both know this as veterans of networks, there are those like ESPN who will basically say, go out and do it, it's okay, it gets people to talk about us. So where do you draw the line?
You have to make that determination for yourself. Am I willing to stand up for what I said, and am I willing to not apologize? Do I feel like what I'm saying is exactly representative of what I think, and that nobody else can come back at me in a way here and misrepresent it? Unfortunately, that's where we stand. So that's one thing. The other thing, though, I think that's really important here, and especially in the Keith Olbermann case, is don't get yourself into fights with people who do not matter to you.
You're an adult. You're an adult, Carol, for crying out loud. He's a grown man getting into it with college students.
It's your Twitter channel, Ed, your Facebook channel. That is your channel. You produce the content. And just because somebody says something that you find wrong or something that you find offensive, you do not have to reply to it. That choice is yours. So even if it's coming at you, what you put back out there is completely in your power. So you have to think twice and have a filter before you put it out there. Because even if you delete it, somebody is going to find it, and that is going to live on forever.
And you also have to realize that this is an employment issue, because we mentioned Jeb Bush, and this was a 31-year-old guy who was hired by Jeb basically to be one of his assistants. He had stuff that he said 6 years ago in Twitter that was basically deleted, came back. He was talking about sluts, sex, and drunk driving. Carol, I only got 30 seconds left here, but you've got to at least realize that this stuff, if it's an employer involved, you got to toe the line.
Absolutely. And by the way, if you're a conservative, know that people are going to judge it 3 times more harshly than they will anything else. So that gives you an extra burden of responsibility.
If you are a conservative and you have somebody on the other side who is a liberal, they will indeed. I think it might be 10 times worse. But then again, let's be honest. Conservatives do it to liberals. Liberals do it to conservatives. It happens back and forth. Just don't do it, people. We really don't want to see your dessert, okay? We really don't. Hold on a couple of minutes here, Carol. Let us sally forth next to the nation's capital and another example of petulance and power. Gee, what a shock that is, seen as we're talking about D.C., right? That and so much more, including telling it like it is later this hour, right here on MidPoint. Okay, back to work with CNBC contributor, best-selling author and investor, radio talker, and who is still living the shame of a recent blowout victory by my Boston Bruins over her Chicago Blackhawks, 6-2. Carol Roth joins us. You didn't think you were going to get away, did you?
Well, Ed, I feel like the timing on that's like kicking a woman when she's down, given that Patrick Kane just got injured yesterday and we're not sure when he's coming back. And on the Bulls side, we lost D Rose too. So it's a very sad day here in Chicago. And not the timing of that was just brutal.
And I do want to point out too that the Bruins, we lost David Krejci. So don't worry, we're not going far in the playoffs at all. I get it. This is my one moment just to go ahead and say
all right, well, our hearts will go out to each other then.
There you go. Okay, 6-2 was the final. All right, here we go. A few things here. Britain becomes the first nation to legalize 3-parent babies. Is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I know that this is probably a good intention. It's meant to avoid certain medical issues, but you and I have talked about before off camera, Ed, that people don't always have the best taste. And so I feel like this is a gateway drug to coming up with the designer babies. And if you've ever seen the way that people decorate their houses or how they dress themselves when they shop at mass retailers, for example, you know that people don't have very good taste and are often very tacky. So I feel like this just kind of opens things up for people to be making the kind of choices that they probably shouldn't be making to begin with.
You would have to admit, though, because this is the DNA from a mother, a father, and from a female donor, there are some women who simply cannot carry to term, and there are some people who want to have children. So you would have to say, though, that this is not entirely bad, but it's just something that needs to be watched and make sure that it's not, it doesn't turn into something a little more, what do you want to call it, evil down the road?
That's the problem, is it always does turn into something else. It always starts out with a good intention, and we're just going to go this far, and people at the end of the day can't be trusted. So as I said, I feel like it has the good intention. I feel like it's going to be bastardized, because when money comes into play and people's greed and their ego comes into play, it always gets bastardized. So great intention is going to end up a disaster. You heard it here first.
All right. Speaking of good intention, Chris Kyle tried to do something right for a fellow vet, Eddie Ray Ralph, who was suffering, apparently, they thought, from PTSD, was having trouble. Kyle and his friend killed by Ralph. And the guilty verdict delivered yesterday in the murder trial. They did not buy the insanity defense. What do you think? Did they do it correctly, or should they perhaps have taken into account some of what this man went through?
No, I think, first of all, there's absolutely no justice that can be given when somebody's life is taken. There is a wife who lost her husband, there are children who lost their father, and there is no way to give justice. So I think that they did the best that they could in the circumstances, and I certainly hope that it gives some closure to the Kyle family. But what I do want to say about this is that obviously Mr. Raup was suffering and had some form of mental illness, and I think that it's incumbent upon people who have family members who are suffering, who are mentally ill, and who are dangerous to speak up and to take action. It seems, from my perspective, that the mother clearly knew that her son was having these issues and should not have allowed him to go with Mr. Kyle and his friend without saying something. And I feel like there is just not enough action that's being taken on the part of family members. They're trying to protect their loved ones, but they end up hurting other people. And it happened in this case. It happened with Adam Lanza. It happened so many times before. If this is your situation that you're in, you need to take action.
And also, you need to be very careful. You need to watch what's happening here. You need to be careful of the people. And again, I still need to say this. There is, and PTSD is real. We have to understand this. But certainly, it would seem as if the evidence here proved that this gentleman knew what he was doing, and that in itself is pretty damning indeed. So don't worry about it. I'm sure we're going to be hit with the appeals now for at least the next several years. But as somebody said recently, he better watch his step in prison. Let's just put it that way.
Certainly.
Carol, always a pleasure to have you on the show. I promise I won't mention hockey next time. How's that?
Yeah, thank you, Ed. I appreciate that.
Always a pleasure, Carol. Take care. All right. Telling it like it is, a star athlete, an alleged criminal act, and how we can tell that the sport of NASCAR is now a fully grown-up major American sport, frankly because they've learned from the big boys. We'll close out this edition of MidPoint right after this.